Please follow me. The little black girl told the biker as rusted doors slammed inside the furnace hall. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into this heart-pounding story. It's a night like no other. The air is thick, heavy with the scent of old rust and the distant sound of creaking metal. In the heart of the city, far from the safety of well-lit streets, a little black girl is running for her life. Barefoot and terrified, she sprints through the darkened alleys, her breath shallow and fast. Every step feels like a battle, the cold concrete beneath her feet a constant reminder that she's far from home. She's alone. Her heart pounds in her chest as she glances over her shoulder, feeling the weight of something sinister closing in. The city streets are quiet, but the sound of footsteps behind her is unmistakable. Her body trembles as she knows they're not just chasing her, they're after her brother. Her last hope is to get to them, to the bikers. She can see the lights in the distance. The motorcycles are parked, their engines silent for now, but the bikes are not just machines. They're her lifeline, her chance to survive. As she gets closer, the familiar smell of gasoline and leather fills her lungs. She doesn't even hesitate. She runs right up to the first biker she sees, her small hands trembling as she grabs onto his jacket. Please follow me, she begs, her voice breaking with desperation. Her eyes are wide with fear, and the biker can see the terror written all over her face. The others notice her now, and their faces harden as they realize something is wrong. This little girl is in danger, and there's no time to waste. She pulls at his jacket again, this time harder, as if she's trying to drag him with her. Please, you have to follow me, she cries, her voice barely above a whisper. The biker looks at her, his eyes softening with a protective instinct he hasn't felt in years. He knows that this isn't just some random request. This is serious. This is life and death. Without a word, he gives a nod to the others, signaling that they're going with her. But they don't know what's waiting for them. The furnace hall, a place of shadows and forgotten memories, is the last place anyone would want to go. The doors are rusted, old, but they've never been more ominous. As they follow the little girl, the atmosphere shifts. The air grows colder, and the silence around them feels suffocating. The tension is thick, and with every step they take, they know they're getting closer to something they might not be able to stop. There's no turning back now. The bikers know they have to do whatever it takes to save her. But as they approach the old building, they start to hear strange sounds from inside. The creak of rusted doors slamming, the scrape of metal against stone. Something isn't right, and they can feel it in their bones. The girl leads them through the shadows, her small form moving faster than anyone expected. Her voice cracks as she tells them her story, about how her brother was taken, how her life was shattered in an instant. The bikers listen, their expressions darkening. They know this is no ordinary rescue mission. This is personal. This is a fight they didn't expect to have to face tonight, but one they can't back down from. As they draw nearer to the furnace hall, they prepare themselves for whatever comes next. The gates are about to open, and the real battle is just beginning. As the group of bikers followed the little girl through the dark streets, the silence around them seemed to deepen. The only sound breaking the stillness was the steady rhythm of their boots against the cracked pavement. The girl led them swiftly, her small figure barely visible in the dim light of the street lamps. They had no idea where they were headed, but the urgency in her voice left no room for hesitation. Every step they took seemed to draw them closer to something darker. The further they went, the more they felt a chill in the air, a sense that something was terribly wrong. The furnace hall wasn't just an old building, it was a symbol of fear and danger, a place where the lost were forgotten, and where darkness seemed to swallow everything in its path. The bikers exchanged worried glances, their instincts telling them this would be no ordinary rescue mission. They had dealt with their share of dangerous situations, but this felt different. The girl's distress was palpable, and her fear was contagious. Hawk, the leader of the group, kept his eyes on her as she moved ahead, her body tense and her pace quickening. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap, but there was no turning back now. They had to see this through. As they reached the outskirts of the furnace hall, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The old, rusted gates loomed in front of them, their metal surfaces covered in layers of grime. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the buildings around them seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect. The girl stopped in front of the gates, her breathing rapid and shallow. "This is it," she said softly, her voice trembling. "They're inside." Hawk knelt down beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We're here now. You're safe with us," he reassured her, though even he wasn't sure if that was true. The sound of rusted doors slamming shut echoed from within the hall, sending a shiver down his spine. It was like something, or someone, was locking them out. He signaled for his men to spread out, each of them taking their positions. Diesel, the massive man with a voice like thunder, moved toward the back of the building, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. Wrench, the quiet one with a sharp eye, stayed near the front, watching the girl closely. Hawk himself stood at the gates, his mind racing with thoughts of what could be waiting inside. Every instinct told him that this place was no longer just a building. It was a prison, and the people inside weren't just hiding. They were preparing for something. Hawk took a deep breath and stepped forward, his boots echoing in the silence. The others followed him, their steps synchronized, like soldiers on a mission. As they moved closer to the door, the girl stopped again. "Please," she whispered, "my brother? He's in there." Hawk nodded, his jaw clenched in determination. "We'll get him. We're not leaving without him." But as they reached the door, something shifted. The sound of voices, muffled but distinct, filtered through the thick walls of the building. The bikers froze. These weren't the voices of people in distress. No, these were voices of power. The kind of voices that told you something dangerous was about to happen. Hawk glanced over his shoulder at the rest of the group. His mind raced. They weren't just here to save a child. They were here to face something much darker. The girl stepped forward, her small frame trembling. He's one of them," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "He's not like me." Hawk's stomach dropped. He had been prepared for a fight, but not for this. The girl's brother, the one they had come to rescue, was involved in whatever twisted things were happening inside the furnace hall. It was a revelation that hit harder than anything he had expected. Hawk turned to face the bikers. "We don't know what we're walking into," he said quietly, his voice filled with grim resolve. "But we're not backing down. Not now. Not ever." With that, he pushed the door open. The hinges screamed in protest, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. The room inside was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the floor. There were figures moving in the darkness, silent, ominous. The bikers stepped inside, their senses on high alert. The girl was right. This wasn't just about rescuing a child anymore. This was about confronting something far more sinister. Hawk's hand instinctively went to his side, where his knife was sheathed. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready. The rest of the bikers moved in formation, their eyes scanning every corner of the room. And as the door slammed shut behind them, they knew this was just the beginning of a battle they might not win. The door creaked shut behind them, sealing the bikers inside the dimly lit furnace hall. The air felt heavy, thick with tension, as the sound of muffled voices grew louder. Hawk signaled for the others to stay close, his eyes scanning the shadows that danced along the cracked walls. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was no longer just about rescuing a little girl. It was about something much darker, something that might change everything. The group moved forward in silence, their boots heavy on the concrete floor. The girl led them deeper into the building, her small frame trembling with fear. Her brother was somewhere in here, and Hawk knew they had to find him, no matter the cost. The atmosphere inside the hall was suffocating. The rusted beams overhead seemed to sag with age, the walls covered in grime and peeling paint. As they passed through the narrow hallway, the air grew colder, and Hawk couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. Every step echoed in the eerie silence, amplifying the tension building inside the group. Suddenly, the girl stopped in her tracks, her face pale. She pointed to a door at the end of the hallway, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's in there," she said, her eyes wide with terror. Hawk's heart sank. He could feel the weight of the situation closing in on him. The door was old, its wood warped and cracked, but it seemed to radiate danger. The girl's brother was behind that door, and whatever had happened to him was beyond anything Hawk could have prepared for. "Stay close," Hawk muttered, as he motioned for the others to follow. They approached the door slowly, each biker bracing themselves for what lay ahead. The closer they got, the more Hawk's instincts screamed at him. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he reached for the handle. With a sharp breath, he turned it and pushed the door open. The hinges squealed in protest, breaking the silence. What they found inside took them all by surprise. The room was small, dimly lit by a single, flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. At first glance, it seemed abandoned, the floor covered in dust and debris. But as Hawk's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw him. The girl's brother, sitting in the corner, his head hanging low. He looked up as they entered, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Who are you?" the boy asked, his voice shaky. "What's going on?" Hawk stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "We're here to help," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're safe now." The boy looked up at him, his eyes filled with both hope and uncertainty. He hesitated for a moment before standing up slowly, his legs unsteady. I don't know what happened," he said, his voice cracking. They took me. My mom. She never came back." Hawk's heart clenched. The boy's words were like a punch to the gut. It was clear now that the situation was far worse than they had imagined. The girl wasn't the only one who had suffered. Her brother had been pulled into something much darker, something that stretched far beyond their understanding. Hawk turned to the girl, who stood silently in the doorway, watching her brother with a mixture of relief and fear. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "We're getting you both out of here." But even as he spoke the words, Hawk knew they weren't out of danger yet. The sounds from deeper within the building were growing louder, more frantic. It wasn't just the girl and her brother who were in trouble. There was something else lurking in the shadows, something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. As the bikers began to back away from the door, they heard the sound of footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate, like someone was following them. Hawk's instincts kicked in, and he spun around, his hand reaching for his knife. The others did the same, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. It was then that they saw him. A tall figure, his face obscured by a dark hood, stepped into the doorway. His presence was like a weight in the room, his eyes cold and calculating. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice low and menacing. Hawk's grip on his knife tightened. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the rising tension. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the group. "You're not the first to come looking for them," he said with a sneer. "And you won't be the last. But you're too late. The game's already over." Hawk's mind raced. This was no ordinary fight. It was a trap, and they had walked right into it. He glanced at the rest of the bikers. They were ready. There was no turning back now. With a single nod from Hawk, the bikers moved into position, their eyes locked on the man in front of them. The room seemed to close in around them as they prepared for what was to come. The battle for their lives was just beginning. The man stepped closer, his dark hood casting a shadow over his face, but his eyes gleamed with an unsettling calmness. The bikers instinctively tightened their grips on their weapons, preparing for the worst. Hawk stood firm, his jaw clenched as he sized up the figure before him. He could feel the tension in the room growing thick, the air growing heavier with every passing second. "What do you want from us?" Hawk demanded, his voice steady but laced with an underlying fury. The man's lips curled into a slight smirk as he took another step forward. "You should have stayed out of this. You're already in too deep," he replied, his voice low and cold. Hawk's instincts were sharp. He knew that the man was trying to provoke them, to make them lose their cool. He wasn't about to fall into that trap. With a quick gesture, Hawk motioned for the bikers to circle the room, blocking off all exits. They had to stay calm and focused. "We came for the girl and her brother," Hawk said, his voice unwavering. "Nothing more, nothing less. But if you're in our way, we'll take care of that too." The man laughed, a dark, hollow sound that echoed through the room. "You think you can stop what's coming? You think you can just waltz in here, take them, and walk away?" he said, his words dripping with disdain. Hawk's grip tightened on his knife, but he remained composed. "We'll walk away with them, or we'll leave you here in pieces. Your choice." The man's expression faltered for a brief moment, and for the first time, Hawk saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You really think it's that simple?" the man sneered. "You have no idea what you're up against." Hawk didn't flinch. He had dealt with people like this before. "I don't need to know everything. I know enough to take you down." The man's eyes narrowed, and he gestured toward the shadows in the corner of the room. "You're not the only ones who've been watching. You're not the only ones who have a stake in this." Before Hawk could react, the room suddenly seemed to come alive with movement. Shadows shifted and figures emerged from the corners, stepping forward into the dim light. They were not the typical thugs Hawk had expected. These people were different, more organized, more dangerous. The bikers braced themselves, ready to fight, but Hawk held up his hand, signaling them to hold back for a moment. The man had clearly been expecting a confrontation, but Hawk wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of charging in blindly. "So, what's the deal?" Hawk asked, his voice calm despite the rising tension. "Who are these people, and what do they want?" The man took a deep breath, his posture straightening as if preparing to make his next move. "These are my people, my family," he said, his tone laced with pride. "And you're in the way of something much bigger than you understand." Hawk's mind raced. There was more to this than just a simple kidnapping. These people weren't just criminals. They were part of something much larger, something that could have far-reaching consequences. The man's eyes locked onto Hawk's, his gaze cold and unwavering. "You've already crossed a line by coming here. Now you're part of something you can't escape. You're in this whether you like it or not." Hawk didn't respond immediately. He was processing the man's words, trying to make sense of the situation. The bikers around him were ready to spring into action at any moment. But Hawk knew they had to be strategic. This wasn't just a fight, it was a war, and they had just walked right into the middle of it. The man took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he repeated. "But I'm going to show you." Without warning, he snapped his fingers, and the figures in the shadows moved in sync, circling around the bikers. Hawk's senses went on high alert as he scanned the room, calculating their every move. The girl and her brother were still in the room, but Hawk knew they were running out of time. He needed to make a move before it was too late. "Everyone stay sharp," Hawk ordered in a low voice, his eyes never leaving the man in front of him. "This is just the beginning." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Hawk could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't leaving here without the kids. With a sudden movement, Hawk lunged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light. The man was quick, but not quick enough. Hawk's blade found its mark, cutting through the air with precision. The man stumbled back, but he didn't fall. He grinned, wiping the blood from his lip. "You'll regret that," he said, his voice low and full of venom. Hawk didn't flinch. "I'm already past regret," he said, his eyes locked on the man's. "Now it's your turn." The room erupted into chaos. The bikers fought back with everything they had, their movements fluid and precise. Hawk kept his focus on the man in front of him, determined to end this once and for all. But as the fight raged on, Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The deeper they got, the more questions they had, and the more dangerous their mission became. They had come for the kids, but they were about to uncover a whole new world of danger, a world they were now a part of, whether they liked it or not. The chaos in the room escalated quickly, with the sound of clashing fists and the roar of motorcycle engines echoing through the dark hall. Hawk kept his eyes fixed on the man in front of him, the one who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. The room felt like a pressure cooker, the tension unbearable as fists flew and the bikers fought back with fierce precision. But Hawk knew this was only the beginning. They weren't just fighting for the girl and her brother anymore. They were fighting to survive. As the man staggered back after the knife wound, his dark eyes gleamed with a mixture of pain and fury. He wiped the blood from his lip, his grin only widening. "You don't know what you're messing with," he spat. "You think you're just saving a couple of kids? This is bigger than you can imagine. You're in a war now." Hawk's mind raced, trying to make sense of the man's words as he lunged forward again. He wasn't about to back down now. He had made a promise to the girl's father. He was going to see this through. The other bikers were engaged in their own battles, but Hawk stayed focused on the man in front of him. The fight was escalating, and Hawk could sense the urgency in the air. The sound of more footsteps came from the shadows, more figures emerging, ready to join the fray. Hawk didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, using the momentum of the fight to his advantage. His knife flashed through the air again, narrowly missing the man's arm as he ducked and swerved. This man wasn't just some thug. He was trained, ready for a fight. Hawk had to be smarter. The girl and her brother were still in danger, and the longer this dragged on, the worse it would get. The man backed away, retreating into the shadows for a moment as if evaluating his next move. Hawk took a step forward, his grip tight on the knife. "Where are they?" he demanded. "The kids. Where are they hiding?" The man just laughed, the sound chilling in the silence that followed. "You'll never find them. You think you've got it all figured out, but you're just pawns in a bigger game," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Hawk felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had been right. This wasn't just about rescuing kids anymore. This was something far more dangerous, something they hadn't fully understood when they walked through those doors. The man's laugh echoed in Hawk's mind as he tried to make sense of the situation. He was part of something much bigger, something that had been in motion long before the bikers arrived. Hawk turned to his team, signaling them to push forward. They needed to end this now. No more games. "We move as one," he commanded, his voice low but commanding. The bikers moved in sync, their bodies shifting to surround the man. It was a calculated move, one that would force him into a corner. But even as they closed in, Hawk knew the man wasn't the only threat. The shadows in the corners of the room had been shifting for too long, and Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He needed to act fast. As the bikers closed in, the man finally stopped retreating. He took a deep breath and straightened his back, a look of resolve crossing his face. "You really think you can stop this?" he asked, his voice now steady. "You don't understand. They will come for you. You'll never get out of here alive." Hawk's jaw tightened. He wasn't backing down. "We're leaving with the kids. That's the only thing that matters right now." The man's eyes flashed with an emotion Hawk couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Or something else? Before he could respond, the sound of more footsteps echoed through the hall. This time, there were more of them, more figures emerging from the darkness, circling the bikers. Hawk's heart raced as he looked around. He hadn't anticipated this. The stakes were higher than ever. The bikers fought back with everything they had, but it was clear they were outnumbered. Hawk could feel the pressure mounting as the fight dragged on. But they weren't about to give up. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Hawk's eyes locked onto the man in front of him, a steely resolve in his gaze. "I don't care who you think you are," Hawk said, his voice hard as steel. "We're not leaving without them." The man sneered, but Hawk could see the hint of uncertainty in his eyes now. He knew the bikers weren't backing down. This wasn't just about muscle, it was about loyalty. The bikers were family, and nothing was going to stop them from keeping their promise. The man raised his hand, signaling his followers to stop. The room went silent, save for the sound of heavy breathing and the distant hum of engines outside. Hawk kept his eyes on the man, ready for whatever came next. But something had shifted in the air. The fight wasn't over, but they were closer than ever to getting what they came for. Hawk knew that the end was near, but he couldn't help but wonder what the man had meant. "They will come for you," he had said. Who were they? And what would happen if they didn't get out of there in time? Hawk pushed the thought to the back of his mind. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the kids. They were getting out of this alive, no matter the cost. The tension in the room was palpable as Hawk stood there, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The man in front of him was no longer smiling. His previous cocky attitude had faded, replaced by something much darker. The sound of the bikers regrouping around him was drowned out by the man's cold gaze. Hawk knew they were close, but the path ahead was filled with uncertainty. "We're taking the kids," Hawk said again, his voice unwavering. "You can't stop us." The man didn't respond immediately, but Hawk could see the gears turning in his mind. There was a moment of silence, and for the briefest second, Hawk thought he might actually get through to him. But then, the man laughed, a hollow, humorless sound that filled the room. "You think you can just waltz in here, take what you want, and walk out," he sneered. "This place isn't just a building, it's a stronghold, and you're already in too deep." Hawk's instincts screamed that the man was hiding something. The girl's brother had been taken, and the more Hawk learned, the more he realized that there were forces at play that went beyond what he could handle alone. The man was part of something larger, something more dangerous. And the bikers had just walked into the heart of it. "What do you want with them?" Hawk asked, his voice sharp. The man raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by the question. What I want doesn't matter, he replied, his tone low and menacing. It's what's already in motion that matters. The kids? They're just pawns in a game far bigger than you understand. Hawk's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about a rescue mission anymore. They were being dragged into something much darker. But there was no turning back now. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. You're going to regret this, the man said, his voice filled with an eerie calm. You think you can save them? The truth is, they're already lost. With that, the man made a subtle gesture, and suddenly the room seemed to shift. From the shadows emerged more figures, tall, menacing, and heavily armed. Hawk's eyes narrowed as he realized they were surrounded. It was a trap, and they had fallen right into it. What's going on? One of the bikers whispered, his eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of the situation. Hawk didn't answer immediately. He was too focused on the figures closing in on them. The air was thick with tension, and Hawk knew they didn't have much time. We need to get them out of here, Hawk muttered to his crew, his voice low but urgent. The man in front of him smirked. You're not leaving here alive. You think you're the first to try? Hawk knew the stakes were higher than ever. They were outnumbered, and their mission was becoming more complicated by the second. But there was no backing down now. We've come this far, Hawk said, his voice filled with resolve. We're not leaving without the kids. Without warning, the man raised his hand, signaling his followers to move. The bikers reacted instantly, taking defensive positions as the figures stepped forward. A few exchanged glances, readying themselves for the inevitable fight. Hawk's mind raced. He needed to act fast. But before he could make a move, the man spoke again. You think you can win this fight? He taunted. You're already too late. The kids are just the beginning. The real battle is about to start, and you're already outmatched. Hawk's stomach tightened as he processed the man's words. What had they stumbled into? What was the real threat here? But there was no time to dwell on that now. The bikers moved as one, responding to Hawk's silent command. They were ready. The man's followers advanced, but Hawk and his crew were quicker. The air crackled with tension as fists collided, boots slammed against the ground, and the sound of motorcycles revving echoed in the background. Hawk fought with everything he had, his every move calculated and precise. He couldn't afford to lose. He couldn't afford to let the man and his followers win. The bikers held their ground, each one fighting with fierce determination. But the more they fought, the more they realized the true scale of the situation. This wasn't just a group of criminals. This was an organized operation, with ties that ran deep. The fight raged on, but Hawk knew they were starting to lose control. The figures in the shadows seemed endless, and the more they fought, the more the bikers were getting worn down. Hawk's breath came in ragged gasps as he cut through the crowd, pushing forward toward the man. He had to end this. But just as he thought he had him cornered, the man disappeared into the darkness, his followers scattering behind him like ghosts. Where did he go? One of the bikers called out, but Hawk didn't answer. He was already moving forward, determined to find the man and end this once and for all. The fight was far from over. But as the bikers regrouped and prepared for the next round, Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much worse. They had come for the kids, but now they were tangled up in a web of danger that they couldn't escape. The stakes were higher than ever, and Hawk knew they would have to fight with everything they had if they wanted to make it out alive. The silence in the room was deafening as the last of the figures vanished into the darkness, leaving the bikers in a tense standoff. Hawk stood still, his eyes darting around, every sense on high alert. He could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a battle against something far larger than they had anticipated. The girl and her brother were still in danger, and Hawk wasn't about to leave them behind. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and tension as the bikers regrouped. Hawk's mind raced. They needed to move, but where? They were surrounded, and the more they fought, the more the enemies seemed to multiply. We need to get out of here, Hawk muttered to himself, though it was clear to everyone that escaping wasn't an option. We're not leaving without the kids, he said, his voice steely with determination. Wrench, his eyes scanning the room, nodded in agreement. No way we're backing down now, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The group moved quickly, each biker taking up a defensive position, watching every entrance, every corner. but it was clear that they weren't in control of the situation. They were still too deep in enemy territory, and the shadows seemed to be closing in on them. Hawk turned to the girl, who was still clinging to his side, her small body trembling with fear. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. She nodded, though it was clear that she was just as terrified as the rest of them. "My brother. He's in there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hawk's heart clenched. He could see the fear in her eyes. The brother, the one they had come to rescue, was still out there, somewhere, trapped in the web of darkness that surrounded them. "We're going to get him," Hawk said, his voice filled with resolve. "I promise you that." But as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the tense silence. Hawk's head snapped around, his hand instinctively reaching for his knife. His heart raced. He wasn't prepared for another fight, at least, not yet. He needed to find the kids and get them out of there. "Get ready," he whispered to his crew. "This is it." The footsteps grew louder, and then, emerging from the shadows, was the man they had been chasing, the one who had led them into this hell. His eyes glowed with a sinister gleam as he approached, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You still think you can walk out of here?" he taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. Hawk didn't flinch. He had heard enough of this man's threats. "Where are they?" Hawk demanded. The man's grin only widened. "They're where you'll never find them," he said, his voice cold and mocking. "You're too late. The game's already over." Hawk's blood boiled. He wasn't about to let this man get away with it. "You're not going to win this," Hawk said, his voice steady but filled with fury. "We're getting the kids, and we're leaving." The man took a step closer, his posture relaxed, as if he had nothing to fear. "You really think you can stop me?" he sneered. "You're nothing but a bunch of bikers. You think you can take down an empire?" Hawk's grip on his knife tightened. He knew the man was bluffing. He knew they could take him down, but he also knew that time was running out. The more they fought, the more they were getting pulled into a fight they weren't ready for. "We're not here to take down an empire," Hawk said, his voice cold. "We're here to save the kids. And that's exactly what we're going to do." The man's face twisted with fury. "You're too late," he spat. "You'll never make it out of here alive. This place is where everything ends." Hawk didn't respond. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than words. With a single nod, he motioned to his crew, signaling that they were moving forward. They weren't backing down, not now, not ever. The man lunged forward, but Hawk was ready. With a swift move, he sidestepped and brought his knife down, narrowly missing the man's arm. The fight was on. The bikers fought with everything they had, each of them using their skills and instincts to hold their ground. The room became a blur of motion, fists flying, bodies colliding, and the sound of boots hitting the concrete floor. Hawk kept his eyes on the man, knowing that taking him down was the key to ending this. He couldn't let this man get away, not after everything they had been through. As the battle raged on, Hawk's thoughts were focused on one thing, getting the kids out of here. But the man wasn't going down without a fight. He ducked and dodged, moving like a shadow, every move calculated to keep Hawk at bay. The fight was turning into something much more intense than Hawk had expected, but he wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let this man, or anyone else, stand in his way. With one final move, Hawk lunged at the man, knocking him to the ground. He pressed the knife to the man's throat, his voice a low growl. "Where are they?" he demanded. The man smiled, blood dripping from his lip. "You really think I'm going to tell you?" he whispered. Hawk tightened his grip on the knife, his patience wearing thin. He wasn't going to let this man get away. Not this time. The truth was out there, and Hawk was going to find it, no matter what it took. The fight between Hawk and the man had reached a fever pitch. Every punch, every dodge, every swing of the knife sent shockwaves through the room. Hawk's muscles burned with the effort, but he couldn't stop now. The girl and her brother were depending on him, and no matter how tough the battle, he wasn't leaving without them. The man underneath Hawk's knife was struggling, but the sneer on his face remained. He wasn't just a thug. He was part of something much bigger, and his desperation to protect whatever secrets lay within the furnace hall was evident. "You're not getting away with this," Hawk growled, pushing the blade closer to the man's throat. The man laughed, a sick, twisted sound. "You think you can defeat me? You're outnumbered. You're playing in a game that's already been decided." Hawk's grip tightened on his knife. "I don't care about your game. I care about the kids." "Where are they?" The man's grin only widened. "They're closer than you think," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "But you'll never get to them. Not before it's too late." Hawk's stomach churned as the man's words sunk in. Too late. What did he mean? The thought of losing the kids now, after everything they had been through, was unacceptable. With a growl, Hawk pushed harder, pressing the knife against the man's throat, feeling the resistance of flesh and bone. "Tell me where they are," Hawk demanded again, his voice cold and firm. The man smirked again, seemingly unfazed by the blade pressing into him. "You'll find out soon enough. But be warned, the cost of saving them is more than you can afford." Hawk's mind raced. What was this man trying to say? The kidnapper's cryptic words hung in the air, filling Hawk with a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just a simple rescue. The danger was far deeper, and Hawk was standing on the edge of something far more sinister. Just then, the distant sound of doors opening echoed through the hall. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, approaching quickly. Hawk's instincts kicked in. "Stay alert," he warned his team, never taking his eyes off the man. "We're not alone." The bikers instinctively moved into a defensive formation, spreading out and positioning themselves near the shadows. Hawk's mind raced as he heard more footsteps approaching, the sound of boots echoing in the darkness. It wasn't just the man they had to worry about. The entire building was alive with movement. "What now?" Wrench asked, his voice low and urgent. Hawk's eyes darted toward the entrance, where the sound of footsteps was getting louder. He could see shadows shifting in the dim light, more figures moving toward them. "We hold our ground," Hawk said through gritted teeth. "We stay sharp and don't let them surround us." As the footsteps grew louder, Hawk's heart rate quickened. The danger was escalating, but he couldn't afford to back down now. He had to get to the kids, had to end this before it spiraled any further. Just as the first of the figures came into view, a tall man with dark eyes and a cold smile, Hawk took a deep breath, preparing for the worst. "You're making a mistake," the man said, his voice smooth and calm. "You've stepped into something that's far beyond your understanding. You think you're saving the kids, but what if I told you that they're not the ones who need saving?" Hawk's confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The man stepped forward, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You're in the wrong place, biker. You've been chasing shadows. The kids? They're already part of something much bigger than you could ever imagine." Hawk's pulse quickened as he processed the man's words. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, trying to make sense of the situation. The man's smile widened, and Hawk could see the darkness behind his eyes. "The kids you're trying to save are just pawns. You're playing right into our hands. You were always meant to be part of this. And now, you're too far gone to turn back." Hawk's mind reeled. They had walked into a trap, one so well laid that they didn't even realize it until now. The stakes were far higher than they had ever imagined. The man took another step toward Hawk, his eyes gleaming with cold amusement. "You're already involved, and you'll never escape." Hawk's mind was spinning. What had they gotten themselves into? What had started as a rescue mission had now turned into something far more complicated, something dark and dangerous. And the more the man spoke, the more Hawk realized they were up against something that wasn't just a criminal operation. They were caught in the middle of a much larger, more terrifying plan. As the man's words settled in, Hawk's resolve hardened. He had come this far, and no matter what lay ahead, he wasn't backing down. "We're getting the kids out of here," Hawk said firmly, his voice filled with determination. "And if you're in our way, we'll make sure you regret it." The man's smile faltered for a moment, and for a split second, Hawk saw something like fear flicker in his eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone. The man turned and began to walk toward the shadows again. "You'll regret this," he said over his shoulder, his voice tinged with venom. "No one escapes what's coming." Hawk stood still, watching the man disappear into the darkness. He knew they were in deeper than ever, and the danger was far from over. But one thing was clear, they weren't leaving without the kids. They were going to fight until the end. The tension in the air was palpable as the man disappeared into the shadows, his words hanging heavily in the room. Hawk's fists clenched as he processed what had just been said. They were in too deep. The whole situation had shifted, and the mission to rescue the kids had become something much darker, much more dangerous. The words the man had spoken echoed in Hawk's mind. No one escapes what's coming. But Hawk wasn't the type to back down. He couldn't afford to be intimidated now, not when they were so close. Stay sharp, Hawk said to his crew, his voice low but urgent. We move fast, we move together. We find the kids, and we get out. Now. The bikers nodded, each of them taking a defensive stance. The air was thick with uncertainty, but their resolve was clear. They weren't leaving without the kids. Hawk could feel his heart pounding as they advanced deeper into the building. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, each turn bringing them closer to something they couldn't quite see. The dim light from their flashlights flickered as they moved, casting long shadows across the walls. Hawk's mind raced with questions. What had the man meant? Who were they up against? And why had the kids been taken in the first place? He glanced at the girl, still by his side, her small hand gripping his sleeve tightly. Her fear was almost tangible, and Hawk knew he had to act fast. They didn't have much time. The shadows around them seemed to close in as they moved through the hallways. Hawk could hear the faint sound of whispers in the distance, like voices calling out from the dark. He wasn't sure if they were real or just his mind playing tricks on him, but he knew one thing. This place wasn't just abandoned. There was something alive here, something that wanted to keep them trapped. He turned a corner and paused. In front of him was a heavy door, slightly ajar. His instincts told him to be cautious, but he couldn't waste any more time. They had to find the kids. He motioned for the bikers to spread out, and with one final glance at the girl, Hawk pushed open the door. The room was cold, the air stale with the scent of decay. It was dark, but Hawk's flashlight revealed what looked like a makeshift control room. The walls were lined with monitors and machinery, most of it old and rusted, but still functioning. His heart skipped a beat when he saw what was displayed on the screens. The kids. The girl's brother and several other children were visible in the dim light of the monitors, locked in what appeared to be a cage-like structure. The sight sent a surge of adrenaline through Hawk. They were close. So close. We're getting them out, Hawk muttered under his breath, his voice filled with determination. We're not leaving without them. As Hawk stepped closer to the monitors, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Spinning around, he saw the same man who had taunted them earlier, his eyes cold and unblinking. He had a gun now, aimed directly at Hawk. You think you're in control here? The man sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. You're too late. The children are already part of something much bigger than you can imagine. And you're about to learn just how deep this goes. Hawk's hand instinctively reached for his own weapon, but the man's gun was already trained on him. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Hawk wasn't afraid. He couldn't afford to be. What do you want? Hawk demanded. Why are you doing this? The man's grin widened, his finger tightening on the trigger. What I want is irrelevant, he said coldly. What matters is that you're too far gone to stop it now. The children, the operation, it's all part of something much bigger. Something you'll never understand. Hawk's heart raced as the man's words sunk in. He had been right all along. This wasn't just about a few kids. This was about something far more dangerous, something that stretched beyond what Hawk could comprehend. The man took a step forward, his gun still aimed at Hawk's chest. You've already crossed a line, he said, his voice low and menacing. And now you're going to pay the price. Hawk's eyes narrowed as he looked around, searching for an opening. He couldn't let this man control the situation. He needed to act. We'll see about that, Hawk said, his voice steady. Without warning, he lunged forward, ducking under the man's outstretched arm, and tackled him to the ground. The gun skidded across the floor, and the man cursed as Hawk pinned him down. You're not getting away with this, Hawk growled. But the man's laughter filled the air. You're too late, he repeated, a sense of finality in his tone. Hawk's mind raced. What was this man talking about? What was happening? As the bikers quickly took control of the situation, the girl tugged at Hawk's sleeve, her voice shaking. Hurry. He's right. They'll be here soon. Hawk turned to her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. They had to move. They had to get out of here now, or they would never make it out alive. With one final glance at the man he had pinned to the floor, Hawk grabbed the girl's hand and led the bikers toward the exit. But as they neared the door, the unmistakable sound of sirens filled the air. It wasn't over yet. They were running out of time, and Hawk knew that the real battle was just beginning. The sound of sirens grew louder, echoing through the hallways as Hawk grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her toward the exit. The tension in the air was suffocating, the urgency mounting with each passing second. The bikers were already moving quickly, their footsteps heavy as they followed Hawk's lead. But Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. The man they had just confronted was still on the floor, and though he was subdued for now, Hawk knew there was no time to waste. They had come for the kids, and now they had to get out before the situation spiraled even further out of control. As they neared the exit, the sounds of approaching vehicles intensified, and Hawk's heart raced. He knew they didn't have long before the authorities, or worse, showed up. The group picked up their pace, but every step felt like it was bringing them closer to something far more dangerous. They burst through the exit and into the night, the cool air hitting Hawk's face like a slap. The streets were empty, but the distant hum of engines told him they weren't alone. He looked around, scanning the area for any sign of their escape route. The bikes were parked a few yards away, but the scene was far from secure. "Get to the bikes now," Hawk shouted. The bikers scrambled to move faster, but Hawk's instinct screamed that they were running out of time. As they reached the motorcycles, the sirens blared in the distance. They weren't going to make it out undetected. Hawk helped the girl onto one of the bikes, his mind racing with what to do next. They had to move, and they had to move fast. "Hold on tight," he told her, revving the engine. The sound of the motorcycles filled the air as the group sped off into the night, their headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon. But the pursuit was already underway. The sound of other engines could be heard gaining on them, and Hawk knew they were being followed. His mind raced, calculating their options. They couldn't outrun everyone, not with so many closing in. Hawk glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he saw a line of headlights approaching fast. They were being boxed in, and soon there would be nowhere to go. "We need to lose them," Hawk muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the handlebars. The other bikers were close behind, but they were also at risk. Hawk had to find a way out, and fast. He slammed the throttle down, the engine roaring as he swerved onto a narrow side street. The other bikers followed his lead, but the pursuers were relentless. Hawk's heart pounded as he navigated the twists and turns of the unfamiliar streets. He could hear the sirens, getting louder with each second, but he couldn't stop now. They had to get the kids to safety. As they sped through the city, Hawk's mind raced with a single thought: escape. They needed to get out of the city, away from the chaos. But how? The streets seemed to stretch on forever, the headlights of their pursuers growing ever closer. Hawk's grip tightened as he scanned the road ahead. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever. Then, he saw it. A bridge up ahead, an old, narrow structure that led out of the city and into the surrounding hills. It was their only chance. "Everyone, follow me," Hawk shouted. The group shifted into formation, their bikes roaring as they headed straight for the bridge. But just as they were about to cross, a vehicle pulled up ahead, blocking the road. Hawk swerved to the side, narrowly avoiding a collision, but the others weren't as lucky. "Hey!" A couple of the bikers skidded to a stop, the sound of their tires screeching in the night air. Hawk's heart raced. They couldn't stop now. "Move! Move!" he yelled, his voice strained with urgency. The bikers who had stopped quickly recovered, gunning their engines as they joined the others in a high-speed chase. But Hawk knew this was their last chance. They had to get to the hills. They had to get off the road. With a sharp turn, Hawk led the group onto a dirt trail that ran parallel to the river. The rough terrain jolted them as they sped through, but it was their only shot. The city was closing in behind them, the sirens now a constant roar in the distance. Hawk's eyes flickered back and forth, scanning the trail ahead. They were gaining ground, but they were still not safe. As they climbed higher into the hills, Hawk could feel the pressure of the chase weighing on him. But he couldn't let up. Not now. The girl was still with him, her face pressed against his back, clutching tightly to his sides. Hawk's mind raced. They were so close to getting out. He could hear the motorcycles behind them, the sound of their engines growing louder as the pursuers refused to give up. Hawk's heart beat faster. They had to get through these hills. They had to reach the safe house just beyond the ridge. But with every turn, Hawk knew they were running out of time. He could feel the heat of pursuit breathing down their necks. The sirens weren't fading. They were getting closer. Hawk gritted his teeth and slammed the throttle once more, pushing the bike harder. They couldn't stop now. Not when they were this close. The group accelerated, weaving through the narrow paths of the hills, the landscape blurring around them. Hawk's pulse raced. There was no more room for mistakes. They had to make it. As they crested the final ridge, Hawk saw the safe house just ahead, nestled in the trees. It was their last hope. They just needed to make it there. The rest of the bikers were right behind him, and Hawk knew they couldn't afford to lose anyone now. The finish line was within reach, and Hawk wasn't about to stop until they were safe. The sound of their motorcycles echoed through the hills as Hawk and his crew pushed forward, each twist of the throttle bringing them closer to safety. The safe house was in sight, but Hawk could feel the weight of the chase bearing down on him. The sirens were still faint, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the authorities, or worse, the men who had been hunting them, closed in. His knuckles were white as he gripped the handlebars, the wind whipping past him, but he couldn't relax yet. Not until the kids were safe, not until they were out of the line of fire. The dirt trail beneath them became rougher as they made their way through the hills, the bikes jolting with every bump. But Hawk kept his focus, never wavering. He glanced over his shoulder to check the others. The bikers were close behind, and the girl was still clutching tightly to his back, her small frame pressed against him. Hawk's heart tightened at the thought of what they'd been through, what they were still going through. They were almost there. He could see the clearing ahead, the outline of the safe house in the distance. But just as they neared the final stretch, Hawk's instinct screamed that something was wrong. He slowed his bike, scanning the surroundings. The sirens were growing louder again, but it wasn't just the sound of the law closing in. There was something else, something they hadn't accounted for. A flash of movement caught Hawk's eye, and he slammed his foot down on the brake, skidding to a stop. The other bikers followed suit, their engines roaring as they came to a halt. Hawk's eyes narrowed as he scanned the tree line. He saw the glint of something in the distance, figures moving, hidden by the trees. He had no time to think. He had to act. Ambush, Hawk muttered under his breath, his voice tight with urgency. Get ready, everyone. The bikers immediately dismounted, their weapons drawn and ready. Hawk reached for his own, the familiar weight of the gun a cold comfort in his hands. The girl was already off the bike, hiding behind him, her small face pressed into his side. Hawk didn't dare take his eyes off the trees. We need to move fast, he said, his voice low but firm. They're not far behind. The silence of the night was shattered by the sound of rustling from the trees, followed by a series of sharp, crackling sounds. Figures emerged from the shadows, armed and moving quickly. The bikers braced themselves, but Hawk's mind was already calculating the next move. The safe house was within reach, but the path ahead was blocked. They had no choice but to fight their way through. Stay close and stay sharp, Hawk ordered. We make it through this, and we get the kids to safety. The figures from the trees were closing in fast, their movements coordinated, methodical. Hawk's mind raced as he assessed the situation. They were outnumbered, but the bikers had the advantage of speed, and they were used to being in tight situations. This wasn't their first fight. Hawk's hand gripped the gun tighter, his jaw set in determination. The first shots rang out, and the bikers returned fire, the sound of bullets slicing through the air. Hawk didn't flinch, his focus on the task at hand. They had to push forward. He could see the flashes of the enemy's weapons, the trees lighting up with every shot. But Hawk knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. The longer they fought here, the more dangerous it would get. We need to move to the house now, Hawk shouted. The bikers shifted into action, moving in formation as they pushed toward the safe house. The enemy didn't give up easily, and more shots rang out as the bikers ran for cover. Hawk's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the kids, any sign that they were still safe. The enemy was relentless, but Hawk wasn't about to let them take the kids. Not now, not ever. With one final burst of speed, the bikers pushed through, sprinting for the house. Hawk's legs burned as he ran, but the thought of the kids, the promise he had made to their father, kept him going. They weren't losing anyone, not on his watch. Just as they reached the door of the safe house, a loud crash echoed behind them. The bikers turned to see several figures coming through the trees, their guns raised. Hawk's heart raced. He was almost there. They were almost there. With one last effort, he slammed the door of the safe house open and ushered the kids inside. Get in, Hawk shouted to the others, his voice filled with urgency. The bikers poured into the safe house, slamming the door shut behind them just as the enemy reached the clearing. But the fight wasn't over. Hawk could hear the sound of heavy breathing and the constant pounding of fists against the door. They were trapped. The safe house wasn't as secure as he'd hoped. We hold them off, Hawk said, his voice steady. We don't let them get in. The bikers took up defensive positions, setting up barricades and preparing for the worst. Hawk looked at the kids, who were huddled in the corner, their faces pale with fear. He walked over to them, his hand resting on the girl's shoulder. "You're safe now," he said softly. "I promise, we'll protect you. You're not alone anymore." The girl nodded, her small hand reaching for his, her grip tight with trust. Hawk turned back to face the door. The enemy would stop at nothing to break through. But Hawk knew one thing for sure: they were done running. Now, they were going to fight back. The tension in the safe house was unbearable. Hawk stood by the door, his back pressed against the cold wood as he kept his eyes fixed on the barricade they had hastily thrown together. The sound of pounding fists against the door, followed by harsh voices shouting from the other side, echoed in the small room. It was only a matter of time before the attackers broke through. Hawk knew they couldn't afford to wait. "Everyone, get ready," Hawk said, his voice low but urgent. "They're coming. Stay close to the door and be ready to fight." The bikers were in position, each of them looking out the narrow windows, weapons in hand, ready for whatever came next. Hawk turned to the girl, her eyes wide with fear. She was still clinging to his side, her small hand gripping his tightly. He knelt down beside her, his face softening for a brief moment. "You're safe now," he said gently, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll protect you." The girl nodded, her face pale but determined. "Thank you," she whispered. Hawk's heart clenched. He wasn't about to let her down. As the minutes ticked by, the pounding on the door grew louder, more intense. The sound of shuffling footsteps echoed through the hall, and Hawk knew they were running out of time. The enemy was coming in force, and there was nowhere to run. The safe house wasn't fortified enough to withstand a full assault, but it was all they had. "They're almost here," Wrench said from across the room, his voice tense. "We have to hold them off as long as we can." Hawk nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. He could hear the sound of the attackers gathering outside, preparing for the final push. They weren't just going to knock down the door, they were coming for blood. Hawk's mind raced as he thought about their options. The kids were safe, for now, but how long would that last? The bikers had no choice but to fight, and fight they would. They were used to it. They had been in worse situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The door shuddered as the first blow landed, and the barricade creaked under the pressure. The sound sent a chill through Hawk's body, but he refused to move. They were ready. Hawk glanced over at the girl one last time. "Stay down," he ordered softly. "We're going to hold them off. We'll get out of here." She nodded, her eyes wide, but she stayed silent. Hawk turned back to the door. He could hear the attackers shouting now, their voices filled with rage. They were getting closer. The moment was coming. "On my signal," Hawk said, his voice steady. "We take them down." The minutes dragged on as the bikers waited in the tense silence, every one of them poised for action. Hawk could feel his pulse racing in his chest. This was it. The door cracked again as the second blow landed, the force of it shaking the walls. Hawk raised his hand. "Now," he shouted. The bikers sprang into action, pushing through the barricade with one swift move. The door slammed open, and the attackers stormed in, weapons raised. But the bikers were ready. They fought with everything they had, their fists and guns flying in a blur of movement. Hawk's eyes locked on the leader of the group, the one who had been taunting them earlier. He was right in front of him now, and Hawk wasn't about to let him get away. "You'll never win," the man snarled, his eyes wild with anger. Hawk didn't waste time with words. He lunged forward, knocking the man to the ground with a swift punch. The man fought back, but Hawk was faster. The fight was brutal, but Hawk was determined to finish it. He had to. The room around him erupted into chaos, with bikers and attackers clashing in a blur of fists, knives, and gunfire. Hawk could feel the adrenaline surging through his body, every muscle working on instinct. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He had made a promise. "Stay focused," Hawk shouted to the others. "We need to end this." The bikers moved in formation, taking out the attackers one by one. They were fierce, unstoppable, and despite being outnumbered, they held their ground. Hawk's eyes never left the leader, who was still struggling beneath him. The man's eyes were filled with hate, but Hawk saw something else too, fear. "You're done," Hawk said coldly, his grip tightening on the man's collar. "This is over." The man spat in Hawk's face, but Hawk didn't flinch. He slammed him into the ground, pinning him down with a final, decisive blow. The room went silent for a moment as the last of the attackers were subdued. Hawk stood over the man, breathing heavily, his body aching from the fight. But there was no time to rest. The others were already checking the rooms, making sure the kids were safe. Hawk turned back to the girl, who was watching him with wide eyes. She was still safe. They had done it. For now. The sound of sirens still echoed faintly in the distance, but Hawk knew they had bought themselves some time. They had made it through the worst of it. "You're safe now," Hawk said again, his voice softer this time. "We're getting you out of here." He turned to the rest of the bikers. "Let's move. We're not done yet." They all nodded, their expressions grim but resolute. The fight was far from over, but they had won this battle. And that was all that mattered for now. The silence that followed the final confrontation was thick with tension. The immediate danger had passed, but Hawk knew this was far from over. The bikers stood guard, their weapons ready as they checked every corner of the safe house. Outside, the sound of sirens had faded, but the weight of the situation still hung heavy in the air. Hawk wiped the sweat from his brow, his heart still pounding from the chaos. He turned to the girl, who was now standing quietly by the corner, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. She had been through so much already, and Hawk couldn't help but feel a wave of protectiveness wash over him. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice softer than before. She nodded, her small hand gripping the hem of her shirt. "I'm fine," she whispered. "But what about my brother?" Hawk's heart tightened. The brother. He had promised to bring them both to safety. They hadn't forgotten him. Hawk turned to the bikers, his eyes scanning the room. "Check the perimeter. Make sure we're not being followed." The bikers nodded, moving out into the hall. Hawk approached the girl, kneeling down to her level. "We're going to get him. I promise." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also with trust. "Thank you," she said quietly. Hawk could feel the weight of that gratitude pressing on him. He had to keep his promise. The bikers returned a few minutes later, their faces grim. "The place is clear," Wrench said, his voice low. "But we need to move fast. We don't know when the authorities will show up." Hawk nodded, his mind racing. "We'll leave in 10 minutes. Get the bikes ready." He turned to the girl. "Are you ready to go?" She nodded, though Hawk could tell she was still processing everything that had happened. Hawk felt a pang of guilt. She had been through so much already. But there was no time to waste. They had to leave before more danger found them. Hawk stood up, his body sore from the fight, but the adrenaline was still keeping him on edge. He moved toward the back door of the safe house, peeking out into the alley. It was quiet. Too quiet. But that didn't mean they were safe. They needed to get out and get to the bikes as quickly as possible. He heard the sound of motorcycles revving in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. "Let's move. Now," Hawk shouted. The bikers quickly filed out, heading toward the back of the house where their motorcycles were parked. Hawk kept a sharp eye on the surroundings, his hand on his gun as he led the group to the bikes. The girl stayed close to him, her eyes darting around nervously. Hawk couldn't blame her. This wasn't over yet. They had made it through the fight, but getting out of the city would be the real challenge. As they reached the motorcycles, Hawk turned to the group. "Stay together," he ordered. "We're not stopping until we're out of the city. Stay sharp." The bikers revved their engines, and Hawk led the way, speeding down the alley and onto the main road. The city streets were eerily quiet, but Hawk could sense the danger lurking just behind them. They had been lucky so far, but that luck wouldn't last forever. The sirens were still distant, but Hawk knew that wouldn't last. They had to outrun whoever was chasing them. The group weaved through the streets, their engines roaring, the wind whipping past them. Hawk's heart raced as he pushed the bike harder, taking corners at high speed. His mind was sharp, but he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They weren't home free yet. Behind him, the girl held on tight, her small arms wrapped around his waist. Hawk could feel her fear, but he also knew that she was strong. She had survived this far, and she was not going to give up now. Hawk glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. He could hear the sound of motorcycles gaining on them. They were being followed. Hawk's pulse quickened. They were closing in on the outskirts of the city, but they had to lose their pursuers first. He glanced at the bikers behind him. "Keep up," he yelled. "We're almost there. Stay close." They rode through the empty streets, the city behind them fading into the distance. But Hawk knew this was just a temporary reprieve. The real test was still ahead. As they hit the open road, Hawk gunned the engine, feeling the rush of speed beneath him. The wind whipped past, but his mind was focused. The safe house was just a short distance away, but they couldn't stop yet. The group pushed forward, their engines roaring as they left the city limits behind. But Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. The sound of the motorcycles behind them grew louder, and Hawk knew they couldn't outrun them for long. They needed to find a way to lose their pursuers before it was too late. The road ahead stretched out before them, but Hawk's thoughts were focused on one thing: getting the kids to safety. He wasn't going to let anyone stand in his way. The group pushed harder, taking turns at high speeds, the engines screaming as they tore through the night. The sound of their bikes was deafening, but Hawk could still hear the pursuit, the motorcycles growing closer with each passing second. His heart pounded in his chest as he took another turn, the road winding in front of him. They were almost there. Hawk could see the lights of the safe house up ahead, and the moment they reached it, they could finally breathe. The girl was safe. Her brother would be too. They were almost home. As they reached the safe house, Hawk felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had made it. The road had been long and dangerous, but they had survived. The bikers pulled into the driveway, the sound of their engines finally quieting as they came to a stop. Hawk dismounted from the bike, his legs aching, his body exhausted. But he wasn't done yet. He had to make sure the kids were safe. "We did it," Hawk said softly, looking at the girl. She smiled, her eyes still full of fear, but there was a glimmer of hope in them now. "Thank you," she whispered. Hawk smiled back, the weight of their journey finally lifting. "You're safe now. We'll keep you safe." In this gripping tale of danger and resilience, the bikers from the Hell Angels stories navigate through a world filled with betrayal, chaos, and impossible odds. As the group fights to protect two innocent children from a powerful, sinister organization, they encounter fierce enemies and heart-stopping moments that challenge everything they know about loyalty and survival. The Hell Angels stories showcase their unbreakable bonds as they race against time to get the kids to safety, navigating treacherous terrains and facing brutal opposition. Along the way, they must confront not only the physical dangers, but also the darker forces pulling the strings behind the scenes. As the bikers push through, the stakes rise, and they realize that their mission is part of a much bigger, more dangerous game. From intense firefights to heart-pounding escapes, these Hell Angels stories reveal the lengths they will go to protect their own and those who need them most. With every turn, their strength and determination are tested, but the spirit of the Hell Angels shines through as they fight to ensure the children's safety. The final moments of the story leave us with the undeniable power of the Hell Angels and their unwavering resolve. Get ready for an adrenaline-packed journey that will keep you on the edge of your seat. These Hell Angels stories are far from over, and the next chapter promises even more danger and excitement, proving that the fight for justice never ends.